Well, I think history shows that you shouldn't count your chickens before they hatch. If one goes back to 1942, in August and September, you'll see the German Sixth Army, um, you know, having taken virtually 98% of Stalingrad. There was just a little strip a couple hundred meters wide on the west bank of the Volga River, and everybody expected the Germans to complete the task and push through and take it. And Germany was saying Stalingrad had fallen. It hadn't fallen. And the Russians held on to that bridgehead and were able to expand it and eventually trap the Germans into fighting and surround them. So I'm always loath to say something's over until it's actually over. And the bottom line is, even though Wagner has seized the administrative building in Bakhmut, which was blown up, by the way, blown in place by the Ukrainians, so they raised their flag on the rubble of the structure. And they're saying that this is the center of the town. This is it. We've taken Azovstal, the steel factory. We've taken, pretty much everything worth taking. All you have left are some of these western suburbs. That in effect, Bakhmut has fallen, but there's several blocks in western Bakhmut that are still controlled by the Ukrainians. They're still fighting for the train station. Now, Ukraine's going to lose. There's no evidence that Ukraine is somehow going to hold on like the Soviets did on the west bank of the Volga and suck the Russians into a defeat. But there's still fighting going on. So technically speaking, I don't think you can say that Bakhmut has fallen. I think what Prigozhin's doing, the head of Bakhmut, of Wagner, he's saying that from a practical standpoint, the battle's over. He feels that he has broken the back of the Ukrainian army. They've taken unsustainable casualties. The forces that are left are remnants. There's not the kind of cohesive, organized resistance that existed in the past. And so this is more or less a mopping up operation. And he's probably correct. He's probably correct in that. But still, from the Ukrainian standpoint, they have troops in Bakhmut. They're still pulling triggers, so there's still some fighting going on. So I understand where Wagner's coming from, but I can't endorse that conclusion because purely technically speaking, there's resistance ongoing in Bakhmut, and as long as that happened, it ain't falling.
And when, if it's inevitable, I guess we can't put a timetable on it because it seems like the West, NATO, the United States, they're all invested in pushing it for keeping it going. But once Bakhmut does fall, let's say fighting stops there. what's the significance? I've heard various analyses of this city and why it's so significant. Ukraine, this is, I don't know, it's almost a year now that there's been just, a grind going on there. Thousands upon thousands of Ukrainian troops have died. Russian forces have also been killed in high numbers. Why here? And what will happen, in your opinion, should this city fall to Russia at some point in the future?
Well, the thing about the Bakhmut Soledar complex, Soledar was sort of a sister city of Bakhmut located to the north, is that it's some of the most defensible terrain in Ukraine, both in terms of what's above ground, but also important what's below ground. Giant salt mines. Bakhmut has salt mines. Soledar had salt mines, and this allowed the storage of munitions, equipment, manpower. So it was eminently defensible terrain. The Ukrainians have been fortifying the territory between the two cities, in front of the cities, all around the cities. And so what the Ukrainians did is they opt to take advantage of this. And when the Russians began their meat grinder operations last May, Ukraine said, "We're in for a fight. We're not giving this stuff up. We're putting our marker down on this table." And depends on the whom you talk to. Prigozhin, the head of Wagner, who is not somebody who is prone to exaggeration. He's somebody who's been very honest about the difficulties that his troops have faced, about the casualties they have taken, about the tenacity of the Ukrainian defenders. He's not a propagandist. He's a realist. But he has said that that Wagner has destroyed the Ukrainian army in Bakhmut. And that's the significance of the fighting, because the Ukrainian army decided that this is where we're going to put our flag down. This is where we're going to defend. We're not withdrawing from this. They have committed resources into this fight. And Wagner's been compelled to commit resources as well, and Russia's been compelled to commit more resources. Anybody who thinks this fight is only about Wagner doesn't understand what's going on. There's paratroopers, there's motorized rifle, there's artillery, there's air. Everybody's in this fight, but Wagner is playing a central role in the urban fighting. They're the sort of the shock units that are carrying out the attacks on Ukrainian strong points. But the fact of the matter is, Ukraine's army has been eviscerated here. I mean, some people are talking of upward 80,000 casualties in Bakhmut. 80,000 casualties in Bakhmut alone. And these casualties can't be replaced. I mean, right now the Ukrainians are talking about a spring offensive that they want to launch. Some people say that they've assembled a force of 80,000 that are ready to launch this attack. But I don't know I doubt the numbers are that big. I would imagine the numbers are probably closer to 30 to 40,000. And these aren't the best anymore. The best are dead. The best died in Bakhmut. The best died in Soledar. The best died in Mariupol. The best died in other battles, earlier battles. There was a Ukrainian special forces officer that gave an interview a while back, and many Americans who worked with him and worked with his unit said this unit is as good as anything in NATO has. These guys are really, really good. Well, they were, you see, because he said 80% of them are dead, and he said the people that have been replacing them are young kids with no experience, none whatsoever. So you can't call it a special forces unit anymore. When the vast majority of your troops are dead and those have been replaced, there's nothing special about them. They're just bodies. And that's what's going on with the majority of the Ukrainian military. They've suffered immense casualties. Units that have been reconstituted are being reconstituted with people who lack the experience of the soldiers that had been alive this time last year. They're being thrown in with little training, with an inability to maneuver, to communicate. They're simply plug in a hole and then they die. And that's the reality of the Ukrainian military. So anybody who's studied war knows that offensive operations, large-scale offensive operations, large-scale combined arms operations in the offense is some of the most demanding military missions out there. Requires an extraordinary level of training and coordination. And the Ukrainian military simply isn't up to this task. There are some units that have received this kind of training at Grafenwohr in Germany. The United States has been training them. But again, you can count the total number of troops that have received this training in the low thousands. It's not enough to defeat hundreds of thousands of Russians who have been digging in with triple lines of defense, hardened strong points, fire cauldrons designed to trap the Ukrainians when they attack, break up their attack before they get to the lines, destroy them with counterattacks. The Ukrainians, even if they were able to initiate some sort of offensive action, it would be absorbed and destroyed and routed in short order by the Russians. And so if you combine the suicidal tendencies of Ukraine to throw all their resources into Bakhmut, overcommit, and now they've lost, they're in the process of losing, and then they're going to follow this up with a suicidal spring offensive that has no chance of success. And the end result is the Ukrainian army is gutted with nothing to replace it. And that's why I continue to say that this war is going to be over by the end of summer, late fall at the latest. And there's a chance it could be over sooner because the Ukrainian army is going to be buckling soon. You can't absorb these kinds of casualties, these kinds of losses, and be expected to stay on and carry out the level of resistance that they have done so far. Again, I'm not a fan of the Ukrainian military. I hate the fact that they have a tendency to sing, anthems loyal to Stepan Bandera. I hate the fact that many of their ranks have been permeated with followers of Stepan Bandera. But you can never denigrate their courage and their fighting ability. These people are putting up a struggle. They're resisting. They're making the Russians pay a price for their for their actions. But no matter how brave the Ukrainians are, they just don't have the quantity of troops and the quality of troops necessary to A, successfully defend Bakhmut, and B, carry out the spring offensive. They're doomed on both fronts. And when both of these collapse, as they will, I think you're going to be looking at the Russians, moving towards end game. That is the decisive final defeat of the Ukrainian army that will prompt the Ukrainian government to sue for peace on terms that will be demanded by Russia.
Yeah, and I wanted to get your take before we move on from the battlefront. Your take on this narrative. So, on the one hand, you even have people maybe who are against U.S., Western, NATO aggression when it comes to Ukraine will say, well, Wagner Group is the same as any other military contractor, any other private military contractor. And this is coupled with how the American political establishment, and of course its loyal allies and vassals all across the West, with Wagner being denigrated with this. Well, they're ineffective prisoners. They're all just released prisoners. They're thugs, and they're not to be regarded. But every time I see Russia making progress on the battlefront, it's always Prigozhin and Wagner Group that is basically giving the declarative statements that they've been making progress. And it seems like a lot of I remember last time you were on, Scott, you also talked about how, much of even the partial mobilization that Russia did last year hasn't even reached the battlefield. Wagner's been doing a lot of the fighting. What's the truth here about Wagner then? I'm curious about your opinion on this force in Russia that has seemingly been on the front lines of what has been Russia's special military operation.
Well, Wagner's been around since 2014 in Donbass. It was created as a vehicle to allow the covert supply of military assistance to the Donetsk and Lugansk people's militias. The Constitution of Russia doesn't allow for a private military contractor to exist on Russian soil, but it did exist in Donbass. And it was designed to be a contract vehicle. That is, if Russian specific military skill sets are needed, Wagner would sign up people who possess those skill sets. Sometimes it appears that these people were taken directly from the military, and something in the West we would call sheep dipped, meaning that they sort of signed themselves out of the military, signed themselves into this new entity. The CIA used to do that with a lot of special forces guys. U.S. Air Force officers used to be sheep dipped to go fly for Air America in Laos, and then they'd return back to the Air Force and be undipped, and their career would go on. And it appears that that is the case of what happens here. But the bottom line is the idea of Wagner was to provide specific military skills to the Donetsk and Lugansk people's militias that they otherwise wouldn't have, the ability to operate certain weapon systems, etc. Wagner is a professional military force. It's literally second to none when it comes to certain skill sets. They've been doing this a long time. And this is, of course, the high-intensity conflict in eastern Ukraine. There's literally not a single American special operator out there. I don't care who they are, whether it's Delta Force, SEAL Team 6, or any of the other Tier 1 entities that possess the kind of urban combat experience that Wagner has. We know there's no civilian, there's no, conventional military force in the United States that has this skill set. So I would hesitate, if I were anybody, to say, oh, Wagner's just a bunch of mercenaries. They're not that good. They use prisoners. They do this, that, and the other thing. I just want to remind everybody that Wagner's winning against a NATO-trained army that's been provided with tens of billions of dollars worth of equipment. And Wagner's whooping them, giving them a whooping. So be careful when you say Wagner's this, that, or anything. Wagner's pretty darn good. at what they do. They don't do division-sized armored assaults. So if anybody thinks that Wagner is going to suddenly turn into the equivalent of the 1st Cavalry Division or the 1st Armored Division, no, that's not what they do. What they do is, storm assaults in urban environment, uh, straight up swamping of the enemy. They're very good at coordinating fire support with this, so their communication skills are good. They are very aggressive, and aggression. Gets them good results because an enemy that's aggressively pursued and pressured in an urban environment has no time to rest. Mistakes will be made, and that's why Wagner keeps advancing. But it also means that they get exposed to, fires from the Ukrainians, and so Wagner loses a lot of people. I think this is when Wagner started the Bakhmut Solidar fight back in May of last year. I think it became apparent that this was high intensity combat that would burn Wagner out if they sought to fight it using the resources that they have. And remember, these resources, many of them had been serving in Wagner for 8 years, the total 8 years of the pre-conflict from 2014 to 2022. People with tremendous experience, and Wagner's didn't feel like they should be burning these guys out. So they went with something I think they call it the Operation K, but they went to the prisons and they recruited people in the prisons. There was a screening process. Certain types of crimes weren't allowed to be brought in, but the idea was that you would be purified by fire, and they did that. They recruited thousands of these inmates who were given sufficient training and then sent to the front line to carry out a violent urban assault on the Ukrainians. And these guys are winning. These guys are pretty good. They are very aggressive. They're very committed. They believe that even in death, their reputation will be restored. Their families will be taken care of. This is the kind of hope that they didn't have while seated in prison. And the end result is Wagner's has an unmatched record of military success on the battlefield. These aren't mercenaries; these are very patriotic people, hyper patriotic. They're very dedicated. I just think that the U.S. Military and NATO military should be silent on the issue of Wagner. I mean, if the politicians want to talk about it, but don't embarrass yourself. Don't make a fool of yourself by denigrating a military force that has the accomplishments that Wagner has under its belt. These are unmatched. There's no force on the earth that can match Wagner in terms of their urban conflict skills. Or combat skills. The U.S. military would do well to study this, and hopefully they are studying this in a nonpartisan manner where they can be objective about lessons learned and things of that nature, how to apply some of these lessons learned directly. Other ones can be more suggestive, but the bottom line is we should be adapting to the reality that Wagner faces every day. They're not a criminal enterprise. They are a highly efficient military contract vehicle. I don't like to call them mercenaries because a mercenary fights for the money. Their loyalty is to the dollar. Wagner is not a mercenary outfit. The people fighting are Russian patriots who believe in the Russian cause and are willing to die for the Russian cause. And that goes a long way in terms of providing quality shock troops, people who are willing to give their lives, who won't hesitate to press forward aggressively to gain and sustain a military tactical advantage. Most regular people have sort of the survival instinct, meaning, hey, I want to go home alive. Wagner is, no matter what happens, I want to go home with my reputation, restored. And if that means I have to die to get that done, then they will, but they're not suicidal. It's not like Wagner's throwing human waves in. It's just that they're very aggressive tactics. And the problem is when you attack somebody aggressively of this nature, you swamp them, you overwhelm them, you win. That's why Wagner is winning. But this aggression also creates opportunity for the enemy to ambush you, to hit you when you're least expecting, and inflict casualties. So it's a trade-off, but the end result is what we see on the map. Wagner steadily pushing forward, killing a whole bunch of Ukrainians and outflanking them. But it's misunderstood. And here's the problem about misunderstanding Wagner. It's something I've said many times, but it's applicable here. If you don't define the problem properly, you can't solve the problem, because whatever solution you're coming up to is a solution that has nothing to do with the reality of the problem. You're solving something that doesn't exist. The West, by denigrating Wagner, calling it a private military contractor, calling them mercenaries, is not properly defining Wagner. And therefore, whatever solution they want to come up with to Wagner is not going to work. At the end of the day, Wagner is a professional military organization of extreme capabilities, extreme lethal capabilities, that has proven itself in combat both here and or there in the Ukraine, but also in Syria, in Libya, in Mali, and other places in Africa. They're around to stay. They report to the Russian general staff, and I think they're going to be a component of Russia's military capabilities going forward.
Yeah, and in certain countries in Africa, especially Northern Africa, as you mentioned, Wagner has a presence, and there's a lot of people who in these parts of the world who appreciate their presence because they are effective, and because unlike U.S. military partnerships, there's less of the take and more of the give, more of a cooperative relationship around issues like the proliferation of terrorism, which the U.S. helped sow in that part of the world. And it always gets me thinking back to, well, if Wagner was this, because I'm not a military expert like you, I didn't serve like you, you have all this direct experience. But when I just look at the results and even the coverage, even the slanderous coverage, it pales in comparison to like Blackwater Academy, whatever it's called now, the real mercenary groups that have committed atrocious crimes that even the media has had to acknowledge.
I mean, again, take your average Blackwater guy. They were, initially they were special forces guys who got out to make the dollar, to make a buck. They're professional enough, but at the end of the day, the reason why they got out of the U.S. military and joined Blackwater is they were looking for financial gain. And if you're somebody who has a financial motive, you don't want to die. Now, nobody wants to die, but in the military, sometimes you're given orders that say you're going to die, and you got to obey those orders. That's the military mindset. You took an oath, uphold and defend the Constitution, and you have to obey the lawful orders of your command. Blackwater is not in the business of dying for their country. Blackwater's in the business of doing a mission, making money, and going home. And so there's limitations to what Blackwater can accomplish, because their forces aren't going to go the last full measure, so to speak, to drive home, to do that which is necessary to win, regardless of the potential of loss of life. Wagner soldiers are hyper patriotic. They love Russia. They serve Russia. Yes, they get paid, and they probably get paid well. Not as much as American contractors do, but it's a higher pay, because these are specific skill sets that are needed on the battlefield. But they're also called upon to take great risks, and they do, and they die in large numbers, by the way. But there's a huge difference between Wagner and American private military contractors. Wagner, they fight for Russia. They literally, that's what they're there to fight for, to defend Russia. If you called them mercenary, I think they'd punch you in the mouth. They are contract soldiers. It's just a different contract vehicle, a different payment mechanism. But at the end of the day, They take their orders from the Russian General Staff, who directs their operations on the battlefield. And that's the difference. Blackwater was not part of the U.S. military structure. Blackwater was not responsive to the orders coming from the military. Blackwater worked, for instance, for the State Department, provided contract support for the State Department. So it's a completely different kind. Blackwater never engaged in the level of violence that Wagner is engaged in right now. If Blackwater or whatever their follow-on group is called got into a stand-up fight with Wagner, I can pretty much guarantee who's going to win that fight, and it's not going to be Blackwater. Wagner is the most combat-capable unit in the world today.